Nunc Dimittis by Roald Dahl. It is nearly midnight, and I can see that if I don't make a start with writing this story now, I never shall. All the evening, I've been sitting here trying to force myself to begin, but the more I've thought about it, the more appalled and ashamed and distressed I have become by the whole thing. My idea, and I believe it was a good one, was to try, by a process of confession and analysis, to discover a reason, or at any rate some justification, for my outrageous behavior towards Janet de Pelagia. I wanted, essentially, to address myself to an imaginary and sympathetic listener, a kind of mythical you, someone gentle and understanding to whom I might tell unashamedly every detail of this unfortunate episode. I can only hope that I am not too upset to make a go of it. If I am, to be quite honest with myself, I suppose I shall have to admit that what is disturbing me most is not so much the sense of my own shame, or even the hurt that I have inflicted upon poor Janet. It is the knowledge that I have made a monstrous fool of myself, and that all my friends, if I can still call them that, all those warm and lovable people who used to come so often to my house, must now be regarding me as nothing but a vicious, vengeful old man. Yes, that surely hurts. When I say to you that my friends were my whole life, everything, absolutely everything in it, then perhaps you will begin to understand. Will you? I doubt it, unless I digress for a minute to tell you roughly the sort of person I am. Well, let me see. Now that I come to think of it, I suppose I am, after all, a type. A rare one, mark you, but nevertheless a quite definite type. The wealthy, leisurely, middle-aged man of culture, adored, I choose the word carefully, by his many friends for his charm, his money, his air of scholarship, his generosity, and I sincerely hope for himself also. You will find him, this type, only in the big capitals, London, Paris, New York. Of that I am certain. The money he has was earned by his dead father, whose memory he is inclined to despise. This is not his fault, for there is something in his make-up that compels him secretly to look down upon all people who never had the wit to learn the difference between Rockingham and Spode, Waterford and Venetian, Sheraton and Chippendale, Monet and Manet, or even Pomade and Montrachet. He is therefore a connoisseur, possessing above all things an exquisite taste. His constables, Boningtons, Lautrecs, Redons, Bouillards, Matthew Smiths, are as fine as anything in the Tate, and because they are so fabulous and beautiful, they create an atmosphere of suspense around him in the home, something tantalizing, breathtaking, faintly frightening to think that he has the power and the right, if he feels inclined, to slash, tear, plunge his fist through a superb Dedham Vale, a Mont Sainte-Victoire, an Arles cornfield, a Tahiti maiden, a portrait of Madame Cézanne. And from the walls on which these wonders hang, there issues a little golden glow of splendour, a subtle emanation of grandeur, in which he lives and moves and entertains with a sly nonchalance that is not entirely unpractised. He is invariably a bachelor, yet he never appears to get entangled with the women who surround him, who love him so dearly. It is just possible, and this you may or may not have noticed, that there is a frustration, a discontent, a regret somewhere inside him, even a slight aberration. I don't think I need say any more. I have been very frank. You should know me well enough by now to judge me fairly, and, dare I hope it, to sympathize with me when you hear my story. You may even decide that much of the blame for what has happened should be placed, not upon me, but upon a lady called Gladys Ponsonby. After all, she was the one who started it. Had I not escorted Gladys Ponsonby back to her house that night nearly 6 months ago, and had she not spoken so freely to me about certain people and certain things, then this tragic business could never have taken place. It was last December, if I remember rightly, and I had been dining with the Ashendons in that lovely house of theirs that overlooks the southern fringe of Regent's Park. There were a fair number of people there, but Gladys Ponsonby was the only one beside myself who had come alone. So when it was time for us to leave, I naturally offered to see her safely back to her house. She accepted, and we left together in my car. But unfortunately, when we arrived at her place, she insisted that I come in and have one for the road, as she put it. I didn't wish to seem stuffy, so I told the chauffeur to wait and followed her in. Gladys Ponsonby is an unusually short woman, certainly not more than 4'9" or 10, maybe even less than that. One of those tiny persons who gives me, when I am beside her, the comical, rather wobbly feeling that I am standing on a chair. She is a widow, a few years younger than me, maybe 53 or 4, and it is possible that 30 years ago she was quite a fetching little thing. But now the face is loose and puckered, with nothing distinctive about it whatsoever. The individual features, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the chin, are buried in the folds of fat around the puckered little face, and one does not notice them. Except, perhaps, the mouth, which reminds me, I cannot help it, of a salmon. In the living room, as she gave me my brandy, I noticed that her hand was a trifle unsteady. The lady is tired, I told myself, so I mustn't stay long. We sat down together on the sofa, and for a while discussed the Ashendons' party and the people who were there. Finally, I got up to go. "Sit down, Lionel," she said. "Have another brandy." "Oh, no, really, I must go." "Sit down and don't be so stuffy. I'm having another one, and the least you can do is keep me company while I drink it." I watched her as she walked over to the sideboard, this tiny woman, faintly swaying, holding her glass out in front of her with both hands as though it were an offering, and the sight of her walking like that, so incredibly short and squat and stiff, suddenly gave me the ludicrous notion that she had no legs at all above the knees. "Lionel, what are you chuckling about?" She half turned to look at me as she poured the drink, and some of it slopped over the side of the glass. "Nothing, my dear, nothing at all." "Well, stop it, and tell me what you think of my new portrait." She indicated a large canvas hanging over the fireplace that I had been trying to avoid with my eye ever since I entered the room. It was a hideous thing, painted, as I well knew, by a man who was now all the rage in London, a very mediocre painter called John Royden. It was a full-length portrait of Gladys, Lady Ponsonby, painted with a certain technical cunning that made her out to be a tall and quite alluring creature. "Charming," I said. "Isn't it, though? I'm so glad you like it. Quite charming. I think John Royden is a genius. Don't you think he's a genius, Lionel?" "Oh, well, that might be going a bit far." "You mean it's a little early to say for sure?" "Exactly." "But listen, Lionel, and I think this will surprise you. John Royden is so sought after now that he won't even consider painting anyone for less than 1,000 guineas. "Really?" "Oh, yes, and everyone's queuing up, simply queuing up to get themselves done." Most interesting. Now, take your Mr. Cézanne, whatever his name is. I'll bet he never got that sort of money in his lifetime. Never. And you say he was a genius? Sort of, yes. Then so is Royden, she said, settling herself again on the sofa. The money proves it. She sat silent for a while, sipping her brandy, and I couldn't help noticing how the unsteadiness of her hand was causing the rim of the glass to jog against her lower lip. She knew I was watching her, and without turning her head, she swiveled her eyes and glanced at me cautiously out of the corners of them. "Penny for your thoughts?" Now, if there is one phrase in the world I cannot abide, it is this. It gives me an actual physical pain in the chest, and I began to cough. "Oh, come on, Lionel, a penny for them." I shook my head, quite unable to answer. She turned away abruptly and placed the brandy glass on a small table to her left, and the manner in which she did this seemed to suggest, I don't know why, that she felt rebuffed and was now clearing the decks for action. I waited, rather uncomfortable in the silence that followed, and because I had no conversation left in me. I made a great play about smoking my cigar, studying the ash intently and blowing the smoke up slowly towards the ceiling. But she made no move. There was beginning to be something about this lady I did not much like, a mischievous, brooding air that made me want to get up quickly and go away. When she looked around again, she was smiling at me slyly with those little buried eyes of hers, but the mouth, oh, just like a salmon's, was absolutely rigid. "Lionel, I think I'll tell you a secret." "Oh, really, Gladys, I simply must get home." "Don't be frightened, Lionel. I won't embarrass you. You look so frightened all of a sudden." "I'm not very good at secrets." "I've been thinking," she said. "You're such a great expert on pictures. This ought to interest you." She sat quite still, except her fingers, which were moving all the time. She kept them perpetually twisting and twisting around each other, and they were like a bunch of small white snakes wriggling in her lap. "Don't you want to hear my secret, Lionel?" "It isn't that, you know. It's just that it's so awfully late." "This is probably the best-kept secret in London. A woman's secret. I suppose it's known to about 30 or 40 women altogether, and not a single man. Except him, of course. John Royden." I didn't wish to encourage her, so I said nothing. "But first of all, promise you won't tell a soul." "Dear me." "You promise, Lionel." "Yes, Gladys, all right, I promise." "Good. Now, listen." She reached for the brandy glass and settled back comfortably in the far corner of the sofa. "I suppose you know, John Royden paints only women." "I didn't." "And they're always full-length portraits, either standing or sitting, like mine there. Now, take a good look at it, Lionel. Do you see how beautifully the dress is painted?" "Well, go over and look carefully, please." I got up reluctantly and went over and examined the painting. To my surprise, I noticed that the paint of the dress was laid on so heavily it was actually raised out from the rest of the picture. It was a trick quite effective in its way, but neither difficult to do nor entirely original. "You see," she said, "it's thick, isn't it, where the dress is?" "Yes." "But there's a bit more to it than that, you know, Lionel. I think the best way is to describe what happened the very first time I went along for a sitting." Oh, what a bore this woman is, I thought, and how can I get away? "That was about a year ago, and I remember how excited I was to be going into the studio of the great painter. I dressed myself up in a wonderful new thing I'd just got from Norman Hartnell, and a special little red hat, and off I went. Mr. Royden met me at the door, and of course I was fascinated by him at once. He had a small pointed beard and thrilling blue eyes, and he wore a black velvet jacket. The studio was huge, with red velvet sofas and velvet chairs — he loves velvet — and velvet curtains, and even a velvet carpet on the floor. He sat me down, gave me a drink, and came straight to the point. He told me about how he painted quite differently from other artists. In his opinion, he said, there was only one method of attaining perfection when painting a woman's body, and I mustn't be shocked when I heard what it was. "I don't think I'll be shocked, Mr. Royden," I told him. "I'm sure you won't either," he said. He had the most marvellous white teeth, and they sort of shone through his beard when he smiled. "You see, it's like this," he went on. "You examine any painting you like of a woman, I don't care who it's by, and you'll see that although the dress may be well painted, there is an effect of artificiality or flatness about the whole thing, as though the dress were draped over a log of wood. And you know why?" "No, Mr. Royden, I don't." "Because the painters themselves didn't really know what was underneath." Gladys Ponsonby paused to take a few more sips of brandy. "Oh, don't look so startled, Lionel," she said to me. "There's nothing wrong about this. Keep quiet and let me finish. So, then Mr. Royden said, 'That's why I insist on painting my subjects first of all in the nude.'" "Good heavens, Mr. Royden!" I exclaimed. "If you object to that, I don't mind making a slight concession, Lady Ponsonby," he said, "but I prefer it the other way." "Really, Mr. Royden, I don't know." "And when I've done you like that," he went on, "we'll have to wait a few weeks for the paint to dry. Then you come back and I paint on your underclothing, and when that's dry, I paint on the dress. You see, it's quite simple." "The man's an absolute bounder," I cried. "No, Lionel, no, you're quite wrong. If only you could have heard him, so charming about it all, so genuine and sincere. Anyone could see he really felt what he was saying." "I tell you, Gladys, the man's a bounder." "Don't be so silly, Lionel. And anyway, let me finish. The first thing I told him was that my husband, who was alive then, would never agree." "Your husband need never know," he answered. "Why trouble him? No one knows my secret except the women I've painted." And when I protested a bit more, I remember he said, "My dear Lady Ponsonby, there's nothing immoral about this. Art is only immoral when practised by amateurs. It's the same with medicine. You wouldn't refuse to undress before your doctor, would you?" I told him I would if I'd gone to him for earache. That made him laugh, but he kept on at me about it, and I must say he was very convincing. So after a while I gave in, and that was that. So now, Lionel, my sweet, you know the secret." She got up and went over to fetch herself some more brandy.
"Gladys, is this really true?"
"Of course it's true."
"You mean to say that's the way he paints all his subjects?"
"Yes, and the joke is the husbands never know anything about it. All they see is a nice, fully clothed portrait of their wives. Of course, there's nothing wrong with being painted in the nude. Artists do it all the time. But our silly husbands have a way of objecting to that sort of thing."
"By gad, the fellow's got a nerve."
"Why, I think he's a genius."
"I bet he got the idea from Goya."
"Nonsense, Lionel."
"Of course he did. But listen, Gladys, I want you to tell me something. Did you by any chance know about this peculiar technique of Royden's before you went to him?" When I asked the question, she was in the act of pouring the brandy, and she hesitated,
and turned her head to look at me, a little silky smile moving the corners of her mouth. "Damn you, Lionel," she said. "You're far too clever. You never let me get away with a single thing." "So you knew?" "Of course. Hermione Girdleston told me." "Exactly as I thought." "There's still nothing wrong?" "Nothing," I said. "Absolutely nothing." I could see it all quite clearly now. This Royden was indeed a bounder, practising as neat a piece of psychological trickery as ever I'd seen. The man knew only too well that there was a whole set of wealthy, indolent women in the city who got up at noon and spent the rest of the day trying to relieve their boredom with bridge and canasta and shopping until the cocktail hour came along. All they craved was a little excitement, something out of the ordinary, and the more expensive the better. Why, the news of an entertainment like this would spread through their ranks like smallpox. I could just see the great plump Hermione Girdleston leaning over the canasta table and telling them about it. "But, my dear, it's simply fascinating. I can't tell you how intriguing it is. Much more fun than going to your doctor." "You won't tell anyone, Lionel, will you? You promised." "No, of course not. But now I must go, Gladys. I really must." "Oh, don't be so silly. I'm just beginning to enjoy myself. Stay till I finish this drink anyway." I sat patiently on the sofa while she went on with her interminable brandy sipping. The little buried eyes were still watching me out of their corners in that mischievous canny way, and I had a strong feeling that the woman was now hatching out some further unpleasantness or scandal. There was the look of serpents in those eyes, and a queer curl around the mouth, and in the air, although maybe I only imagined it, the faint smell of danger. Then, suddenly, so suddenly that I jumped, she said, "Lionel, what's this I hear about you and Janet de Pelagia?" Now, Gladys, please." "Lionel, you're blushing." "Nonsense."
"Don't tell me the old bachelor has really taken a tumble at last."
"Gladys, this is too absurd." I began making movements to go, but she put a hand on my knee and stopped me.
"Don't you know by now, Lionel, that there are no secrets?"
"Janet is a fine girl."
"You can hardly call her a girl."
Gladys Ponsonby paused, staring down into the large brandy glass that she held cupped in both hands.
"But of course I agree with you, Lionel. She's a wonderful person in every way, except," and now she spoke very slowly, "except that she does say some rather peculiar things occasionally."
"What sort of things?"
"Just things, you know. Things about people. About you."
"What did she say about me?"
"Oh, nothing at all, Lionel. It wouldn't interest you."
"What did she say about me?"
"It's not even worth repeating. Honestly, it isn't. It's only that it struck me as being rather odd at the time."
"Gladys, what did she say?" While I waited for her to answer, I could feel the sweat breaking out all over my body.
"Well, now, let me see. Of course, she was only joking, or I couldn't dream of telling you, but I suppose she did say how it was all a wee bit of a bore."
"What was?"
"Sort of going out to dinner with you nearly every night, that kind of thing."
"She said it was a bore?"
"Yes."
Gladys Ponsonby drained the brandy glass with one last big gulp and sat up straight.
"If you really want to know, she said it was a crashing bore. And then—"
"What did she say then?"
"Now look, Lionel, there's no need to get excited. I'm only telling you this for your own good."
"Then please hurry up and tell it."
"It's just that I happened to be playing canasta with Janet this afternoon, and I asked if she was free to dine with me tomorrow. She said no, she wasn't."
"Go on."
"Well, actually, what she said was, 'I'm dining with that crashing old bore, Lionel Lampson.'"
"Janet said that?"
"Yes, Lionel, dear."
"What else?"
"Now, that's enough. I don't think I should tell the rest."
"Finish it, please."
"Why, Lionel, don't keep shouting at me like that. Of course I'll tell you if you insist.
As a matter of fact, I wouldn't consider myself a true friend if I didn't. Don't you think it's the sign of true friendship when two people like us—
Gladys, please hurry.
Good heavens, you must give me time to think. Let me see now. So far as I can remember, what she actually said was this.
And Gladys Ponsonby, sitting upright on the sofa with her feet not quite touching the floor, her eyes away from me now, looking at the wall, began cleverly to mimic the deep tone of that voice I knew so well.
Such a bore, my dear, because with Lionel one can always tell exactly what will happen right from beginning to end. For dinner, we'll go to the Savoy Grill. It's always the Savoy Grill. And for 2 hours, I'll have to listen to the pompous old— I'll have to listen to him droning away about pictures and porcelain. Always pictures and porcelain. Then in the taxi going home, he'll reach out for my hand and he'll lean closer and I'll get a whiff of stale cigar smoke and brandy and he'll start burbling about how he wished he was just 20 years younger. And I will say, could you open a window, do you mind? And when we arrive at my house, I'll tell him to keep the taxi, but he'll pretend he hasn't heard and pay it off quickly. And then at the front door, while I fish for my key, he'll stand beside me with a sort of silly spaniel look in his eyes, and I'll slowly put the key in the lock and slowly turn it, and then, very quickly, before he has time to move, I'll say good night and skip inside and shut the door behind me. Why, Lionel, what's the matter, dear? You look positively ill.
At that point, mercifully, I must have swooned clear away. I can remember practically nothing of the rest of that terrible night, except for a vague and disturbing suspicion that when I regained consciousness I broke down completely, and permitted Gladys Ponsonby to comfort me in a variety of different ways. Later, I believe, I walked out of the house and was driven home, but I remained more or less unconscious of everything about me until I woke up in my bed the next morning. I awoke feeling weak and shaken. I lay still with my eyes closed, trying to piece together the events of the night before. Gladys Ponsonby's living room, Gladys on the sofa, sipping brandy, the little puckered face, the mouth that was like a salmon's mouth, the things she had said. What was it she had said? Ah, yes, about me. My God, yes, about Janet and me. Those outrageous, unbelievable remarks. Could Janet really have made them? Could she? I can remember with what terrifying swiftness my hatred of Janet de Pelagia now began to grow. It all happened in a few minutes, a sudden, violent welling up of a hatred that filled me till I thought I was going to burst. I tried to dismiss it, but it was on me like a fever, and in no time at all I was hunting around, as would some filthy gangster for a method of revenge. A curious way to behave, you may say, for a man such as me, to which I would answer, no, not really, if you consider the circumstances. To my mind, this was the sort of thing that could drive a man to murder. As a matter of fact, had it not been for a small sadistic streak that caused me to seek a more subtle and painful punishment for my victim, I might well have become a murderer myself. But mere killing, I decided, was too good for this woman, and far too crude for my taste. So I began looking for a superior alternative. I am not normally a scheming person. I consider it an odious business, and have had no practice in it whatsoever. But fury and hate can concentrate a man's mind to an astonishing degree, and in no time at all a plot was forming and unfolding in my head, a plot so superior and exciting that I began to be quite carried away at the idea of it. By the time I had filled in the details and overcome one or two minor objections, my brooding, vengeful mood had changed to one of extreme elation, and I remember how I started bouncing up and down absurdly on my bed and clapping my hands. The next thing I knew, I had the telephone directory on my lap and was searching eagerly for a name. I found it, picked up the phone, and dialed the number. "Hello?" I said. "Mr. Royden? Mr. John Royden?" "Speaking." Well, it wasn't difficult to persuade the man to call around and see me for a moment. I had never met him, but of course he knew my name, both as an important collector of paintings and as a person of some consequence in society. I was a big fish for him to catch. "Let me see now, Mr. Lamson," he said. "I think I ought to be free in about a couple of hours. Will that be all right?" I told him it would be fine, gave my address, and rang off. I jumped out of bed. It was really remarkable how exhilarated I felt all of a sudden. One moment I had been in an agony of despair, contemplating murder and suicide and I don't know what the next. I was whistling an aria from Puccini in my bath. Every now and again I caught myself rubbing my hands together in a devilish fashion, and once, during my exercises, when I overbalanced doing a double knee bend, I sat on the floor and giggled like a schoolboy. At the appointed time, Mr. John Royden was shown into my library, and I got up to meet him. He was a small, neat man with a slightly ginger goatee beard. He wore a black velvet jacket, a rust-brown tie, a red pullover, and black suede shoes. I shook his small, neat hand. "Good of you to come along so quickly, Mr. Royden." "Not at all, sir." The man's lips, like the lips of nearly all bearded men, looked wet and naked, a trifle indecent, shining pink in among all that hair. After telling him again how much I admired his work, I got straight down to business. "Mr. Royden," I said, "I have a rather unusual request to make of you, something quite personal in its way." "Yes, Mr. Lamson?" He was sitting in the chair opposite me, and he cocked his head over to one side, quick and perky like a bird. "Of course, I know I can trust you to be discreet about anything I say." "Absolutely, Mr. Lamson." "All right. Now, my proposition is this. There is a certain lady in town here whose portrait I would like you to paint. I very much want to possess a fine painting of her, but there are certain complications. For example, I have my own reasons for not wishing her to know that it is I who am commissioning the portrait." "You mean—" "Exactly, Mr. Royden. That is exactly what I mean. As a man of the world, I'm sure you will understand." He smiled, a crooked little smile that only just came through his beard, and he nodded his head knowingly up and down. "Is it not possible," I said, "that a man might be, how shall I put it, extremely fond of a lady, and at the same time have his own good reasons for not wishing her to know about it yet?" "More than possible, Mr. Lamson." "Sometimes a man has to stalk his quarry with great caution, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal himself." "Precisely, Mr. Lamson." "There are better ways of catching a bird than by chasing it through the woods." "Yes, indeed, Mr. Lamson." "Putting salt on its tail, for instance." "Ha, ha!" "All right, Mr. Royden. I think you understand. Now, do you happen by any chance to know a lady called Janet de Pelagia?" "Janet de Pelagia? Let me see now. Yes. At least, what I mean is I've heard of her. I couldn't exactly say I know her." "Oh, that's a pity. It makes it a little more difficult. Do you think you could get to meet her, perhaps at a cocktail party or something like that?" "Shouldn't be too tricky, Mr. Lamson." "Good, because what I suggest is this, that you go up to her and tell her she's the sort of model you've been searching for years. Just the right face, the right figure, the right coloured eyes, you know the sort of thing. Then ask her if she'd mind sitting for you free of charge. Say you'd like to do a picture of her for next year's Academy. I feel sure she'd be delighted to help you, and honoured too, if I may say so. Then you will paint her, and exhibit the picture and deliver it to me after the show is over. No one but you need know that I have bought it." The small, round eyes of Mr. John Royden were watching me shrewdly, I thought, and the head was again cocked over to one side. He was sitting on the edge of his chair, and in this position, with the pullover making a flash of red down his front, he reminded me of a robin on a twig, listening for a suspicious noise. "There's really nothing wrong about it at all," I said. "Just call it, if you like, a harmless little conspiracy being perpetrated by by a rather romantic old man." "I know, Mr. Lampson, I know." He still seemed to be hesitating, so I said quickly, "I'll be glad to pay you double your usual fee." That did it. The man actually licked his lips. "Well, Mr. Lampson, I must say this sort of thing's not really in my line, you know, but all the same, it'd be a very heartless man who refused such, shall I say, such a romantic assignment." "I should like a full-length portrait, Mr. Royden, please. A large canvas, let me see, about twice the size of that Manet on the wall there." "About 60 by 36? "Yes, and I should like her to be standing. That, to my mind, is her most graceful attitude." "I quite understand, Mr. Lampson, and it'll be a pleasure to paint such a lovely lady." "I expect it will," I told myself. "The way you go about it, my boy, I'm quite sure it will." But I said, "All right, Mr. Royden, then I'll leave it all to you. And don't forget, please, this is a little secret between ourselves." When he had gone, I forced myself to sit still and take 25 deep breaths. Nothing else would have restrained me from jumping up and shouting for joy like an idiot. I have never in my life felt so exhilarated. My plan was working. The most difficult part was already accomplished. There would be a wait now, a long wait. The way this man painted it would take him several months to finish the picture. Well, I would just have to be patient, that's all. I now decided, on the spur of the moment, that it would be best if I were to go abroad in the interim, and the very next morning, after sending a message to Janet, with whom you will remember I was due to dine that night, telling her I had been called away, I left for Italy. There, as always, I had a delightful time, marred only by a constant nervous excitement caused by the thought of returning to the scene of action. I eventually arrived back 4 months later, in July, on the day after the opening of the Royal Academy, and I found, to my relief, that everything had gone according to plan during my absence. The picture of Janet de Pelagia had been painted and hung in the exhibition, and it was already the subject of much favourable comment both by the critics and the public. I myself refrained from going to see it, but Royden told me on the telephone that there had been several inquiries by persons who wished to buy it, all of whom had been informed that it was not for sale. When the show was over, Royden delivered the painting to my house and received his money. I immediately had it carried up to my workroom, and with mounting excitement I began to examine it closely. The man had painted her standing up in a black evening dress, and there was a red plush sofa in the background. Her left hand was resting on the back of a heavy chair, also of red plush, and there was a huge crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. My God, I thought, what a hideous thing. The portrait itself wasn't so bad. He had caught the woman's expression, the forward drop of the head, the wide blue eyes, the large, ugly, beautiful mouth with the trace of a smile in one corner. He had flattered her, of course. There wasn't a wrinkle on her face or the slightest suggestion of fat under her chin. I bent forward to examine the painting of the dress. Yes, here the paint was thicker, much thicker. At this point, unable to wait another moment, I threw off my coat and prepared to go to work. I should mention here that I am myself an expert cleaner and restorer of paintings. The cleaning, particularly, is a comparatively simple process, provided one has patience and a gentle touch, and those professionals who make such a secret of their trade and charge such shocking prices get no business from me. Where my own pictures are concerned, I always do the job myself. I poured out the turpentine and added a few drops of alcohol. I dipped a small wad of cotton wool in the mixture, squeezed it out, and then, gently, with a circular motion, I began to work upon the black paint of the dress. I could only hope that Royden had allowed each layer to dry thoroughly before applying the next. Otherwise the two would merge, and the process I had in mind would be impossible. Soon I would know. I was working on 1 square inch of black dress somewhere around the lady's stomach, and I took plenty of time, cautiously testing and teasing the paint, adding a drop or two more of alcohol to my mixture, testing again, adding another drop, until finally it was just strong enough to loosen the pigment. For perhaps a whole hour I worked away on this little square of black, proceeding more and more gently as I came closer to the layer below. Then a tiny pink spot appeared, and gradually it spread and spread until the whole of my square inch was a clear, shining patch of pink. Quickly I neutralized with pure turps. So far, so good. I knew now that the black paint could be removed without disturbing what was underneath. So long as I was patient and industrious, I would easily be able to take it all off. Also, I had discovered the right mixture to use, and just how hard I could safely rub, so things should go much quicker now. I must say it was rather an amusing business. I worked first from the middle of the body downward, and as the lower half of her dress came away bit by bit onto my little wads of cotton, a queer pink undergarment began to reveal itself. I didn't for the life of me know what the thing was called, but it was a formidable apparatus, constructed of what appeared to be a strong, thick, elastic material, and its purpose was apparently to contain and to compress the woman's bulging figure into a neat, streamlined shape, giving a quite false impression of slimness. As I travelled lower and lower down, I came upon a striking arrangement of suspenders, also pink, which were attached to this elastic armour and hung downwards 4 or 5 inches to grip the tops of the stockings. Quite fantastic the whole thing seemed to me as I stepped back a pace to survey it. It gave me a strong sense of having somehow been cheated. For had I not, during all of these past months, been admiring the sylph-like figure of this lady? She was a faker, no question about it. But do many other females practice this sort of deception, I wondered? I knew, of course, that in the days of stays and corsets it was usual for ladies to strap themselves up. Yet for some reason I was under the impression that nowadays all they had to do was diet. When the whole of the lower half of the dress had come away, I immediately turned my attention to the upper portion, working my way slowly upward from the lady's middle. Here, around the midriff, there was an area of naked flesh. Then higher up, upon the bosom itself, and actually containing it, I came upon a contrivance made of some heavy black material edged with frilly lace. This, I knew very well, was the brassiere, another formidable appliance, upheld by an arrangement of black straps as skilfully and scientifically rigged as the supporting cables of a suspension bridge. Dear me, I thought, one lives and learns. But now, at last, the job was finished, and I stepped back again to take a final look at the picture. It was truly an astonishing sight. This woman, Janet de Pelagia, almost life-size, standing there in her underwear in a sort of drawing-room, I suppose it was, with a great chandelier above her head and a red plush chair by her side, and she herself, this was the most disturbing part of it all, looking so completely unconcerned, with the wide, placid blue eyes, the faintly smiling, ugly, beautiful mouth. Also, I noticed, with something of a shock, that she was exceedingly bow-legged, like a jockey. I tell you frankly, the whole thing embarrassed me. I felt as though I had no right to be in the room, certainly no right to stare. So after a while I went out and shut the door behind me. It seemed like the only decent thing to do. Now, for the next and final step. And do not imagine, simply because I have not mentioned it lately, that my thirst for revenge had in any way diminished during the last few months. On the contrary, it had, if anything, increased. And with the last act about to be performed, I can tell you I found it hard to contain myself. That night, for example, I didn't even go to bed. You see, I couldn't wait to get the invitations out. I sat up all night preparing them and addressing the envelopes. There were 22 of them in all, and I wanted each to be a personal note. "I'm having a little dinner on Friday night, the 22nd at 8. I do hope you can come along. I'm so looking forward to seeing you again." The first, the most carefully phrased, was to Janet de Pelagia. In it, I regretted not having seen her for so long. I had been abroad. It was time we got together again, etc., etc. The next was to Gladys Ponsonby, then one to Lady Hermione Girdleston, another to Princess Bisheno, Mrs. Cuthbert, Sir Hubert Call, Mrs. Galbally, Peter Ewan Thomas, James Pisker, Sir Eustace Pygram, Peter Van Santon, Elizabeth Moynihan, Lord Mulherin, Bertram Sturt, Philip Cornelius, Jack Hill, Lady Ackerman, Mrs. Isserley, Humphrey King Howard, Johnny O'Coffey, Mrs. Uvery, and the Dowager Countess of Waxworth. It was a carefully selected list, containing as it did the most distinguished men and the most brilliant and influential women in the top crust of our society. I was well aware that a dinner at my house was regarded as quite an occasion. Everybody liked to come. And now, as I watched the point of my pen moving swiftly over the paper, I could almost see the ladies in their pleasure, picking up their bedside telephones the morning the invitations arrived, shrill voices calling to shriller voices over the wires. "Lionel's giving a party. He's asked you too? My dear, how nice. His food is always so good, and such a lovely man, isn't he, though? Yes." Is that really what they would say? It suddenly occurred to me that it might not be like that at all. More like this, perhaps. "I agree, my dear. Yes, not a bad old man, but a bit of a bore, don't you think? What did you say?" "Dull. But desperately, my dear. You've hit the nail right on the head. Did you even hear what Janet de Pelagia once said about him?" "Ah, yes, I thought you'd heard that one. Screamingly funny, don't you think? Poor Janet. How she stood it as long as she did, I don't know." Anyway, I got the invitations off, and within a couple of days, everybody, with the exception of Mrs. Cuthbert and Sir Hubert Call, who were away, had accepted with pleasure. At 8:30 on the evening of the 22nd, my large drawing-room was filled with people. They stood about the room, admiring the pictures, drinking their martinis, talking with loud voices. The women smelled strongly of scent. The men were pink-faced and carefully buttoned up in their dinner jackets. Janet de Pelagia was wearing the same black dress she had used for the portrait, and every time I caught sight of her, a kind of huge bubble vision, as in those absurd cartoons, would float up above my head, and in it I would see Janet in her underclothes, the black brassiere, the pink elastic belt, the suspenders, the jockey's legs. I moved from group to group, chatting amiably with them all, listening to their talk. Behind me I could hear Mrs. Galbally telling Sir Eustace Pygram and James Pisker how the man at the next table to hers at Claridge's the night before had had red lipstick on his white moustache. "Simply plastered with it," she kept on saying, "and the old boy was 90 if he was a day."
On the other side, Lady Girdleston was telling somebody where one could get truffles cooked in brandy, and I could see Mrs. Isley whispering something to Lord Mulheron while his lordship kept shaking his head slowly from side to side like an old and dispirited metronome. Dinner was announced, and we all moved out. "My goodness," they cried as they entered the dining-room. "How dark and sinister!
I can hardly see a thing.
What divine little candles! Oh, but Lionel, how romantic!" There were 6 very thin candles, set about 2 feet apart from each other down the centre of the long table. Their small flames made a little glow of light around the table itself, but left the rest of the room in darkness. It was an amusing arrangement, and apart from the fact that it suited my purpose well, it made a pleasant change. The guests soon settled themselves in their right places, and the meal began. They all seemed to enjoy the candlelight, and things went famously, though for some reason the darkness caused them to speak much louder than usual. Janet de Pelagia's voice struck me as being particularly strident. She was sitting next to Lord Mulheron, and I could hear her telling him about the boring time she had had at Cap Ferrat the week before. "Nothing but Frenchmen," she kept saying, "nothing but Frenchmen in the whole place." For my part, I was watching the candles. They were so thin that I knew it would not be long before they burned down to their bases. Also, I was mighty nervous, I will admit that, but at the same time intensely exhilarated almost to the point of drunkenness. Every time I heard Janet's voice or caught sight of her face shadowed in the light of the candles, a little ball of excitement exploded inside me, and I felt the fire of it running under my skin. They were eating their strawberries when at last I decided the time had come. I took a deep breath, and in a loud voice I said, "I'm afraid we'll have to have the lights on now. The candles are nearly finished, Mary," I called. "Oh, Mary, switch on the lights, will you, please?" There was a moment of silence after my announcement. I heard the maid walking over to the door, then the gentle click of the switch, and the room was flooded with a blaze of light. They all screwed up their eyes, opened them again, gazed about them. At that point, I got up from my chair and slid quietly from the room. But as I went, I saw a sight that I shall never forget as long as I live. It was Janet, with both hands in mid-air, stopped, frozen rigid, caught in the act of gesticulating towards someone across the table. Her mouth had dropped open 2 inches, and she wore the surprised, not quite understanding look of a person who precisely 1 second before has been shot dead right through the heart. In the hall outside, I paused and listened to the beginning of the uproar. The shrill cries of the ladies and the outraged, unbelieving exclamations of the men. And soon there was a great hum of noise, with everybody talking or shouting at the same time. Then, and this was the sweetest moment of all, I heard Lord Mulheron's voice roaring above the rest. "Here! Someone! Hurry! Get her some water, quick!" Out in the street, the chauffeur helped me into my car, and soon we were away from London and bowling merrily along the Great North Road towards this, my other house, which is only 95 miles from town anyway. The next 2 days I spent in gloating. I mooned around in a dream of ecstasy, half drowned in my own complacency, and filled with a sense of pleasure so great that it constantly gave me pins and needles all along the lower parts of my legs. It wasn't until this morning, when Gladys Ponsonby called me on the phone, that I suddenly came to my senses and realized that I was not a hero at all, but an outcast. She informed me, with what I thought was just a trace of relish, that everybody was up in arms, that all of them, all my old and loving friends, were saying the most terrible things about me, and had sworn never, never to speak to me again. Except her, she kept saying. Everybody except her. And didn't I think it would be rather cosy, she asked, if she were to come down and stay with me a few days to cheer me up? I'm afraid I was too upset by that time even to answer her politely. I put the phone down and went away to weep. Then at noon today came the final crushing blow. The post arrived, and with it, I can hardly bring myself to write about it, I am so ashamed, came a letter, the sweetest, most tender little note imaginable, from none other than Janet de Pelagia herself. She forgave me completely, she wrote, for everything I had done. She knew it was only a joke, and I must not listen to the horrid things other people were saying about me. She loved me as she always had, and always would to her dying day. Oh, what a cad! What a brute I felt when I read this. The more so when I found that she had actually sent me by the same post a small present as an added sign of her affection, a half-pound jar of my favourite food of all, fresh caviar. I can never, under any circumstances, resist good caviar. It is perhaps my greatest weakness. So although I naturally had no appetite whatsoever for food at dinner time this evening, I must confess I took a few spoonfuls of the stuff in an effort to console myself in my misery. It is even possible that I took a shade too much, because I haven't been feeling any too chipper this last hour or so. Perhaps I ought to go up right away and get myself some bicarbonate of soda. I can easily come back and finish this later when I'm in better trim. You know, now I come to think of it, I really do feel rather ill all of a sudden.